Hey everybody, I'm James Riley, the author of several series of books, including Story Thieves, probably my most well-known series. I've been getting a lot of requests from teachers and librarians to see if they could continue reading from my books to classes online now that a lot of schools are canceled, and that's totally fine. But I also thought that in case anyone didn't want to ask, or if kids were interested in hearing it, I would just start reading from each of my three series. I already posted the Half Upon a Time video, that's just chapter one, and I will start reading from Story Thieves chapter one today. I will also, as I get through, without spoiling anything, I'll try to give a little commentary on maybe what I was thinking, some behind the scenes stuff as I go. It probably won't be in chapter one. I didn't have much for Half Fun on Time because I don't want to spoil anything before, and just in case anyone hasn't read it. But as I go, there will be more. So let's start with chapter one of Story Thieves. Excuse my reading, I'm not very good at this. Chapter one. Owen wanted to scream at the horror before him. But the sound wouldn't come, and the nightmare only continued, forcing Owen to ask himself deep down one question. Can anyone tell me what 3/4 times 2/3 is? Mr. Barberry stood at the board at the front of Owen's classroom, his arms folded, waiting for a hand to raise. No, not that question. The real question was this. Was there anything in the world that could possibly be more boring than fractions? Owen frowned as Mr. Barberry gave up on volunteers and just picked someone. Mary? 3/4 times 2/3? Being locked in a room with no windows or doors without anything to do, while wearing a blindfold and being forced to name various types of trees? That'd be pretty boring, but not fractions boring. 1/2, Mary answered, and Mr. Barberry nodded. Maybe if someone gave you enough soda to keep you awake for hours, then read furniture building instructions to you, in another language, that might be really boring. Except what if you accidentally started to learn that foreign language without realizing it? That'd almost be considered worth it to some people. So that was out. Owen, Mr. Barberry said, how about you? 1/3 times 2/3. 2/9, Owen said, faking enthusiasm. That's right, Mr. Barberry said, and turned back to the board while Owen let his mind wander again. Maybe being stuck home sick and too feverish to think or do anything except watch TV, and the only channel that came in was an infomercial for other infomercials. That would be pretty boring. 1/3 times 1/3, Mr. Barberry asked. Gabriel? 1/9, Gabriel answered, his eyes glazed over. No, fractions still won. By a lot. If only the bell would ring early from some freak electrical surge. Sure, it had never happened before, but Owen was nothing if not optimistic, and that was something he was pretty proud of, since it wasn't easy to be optimistic in the face of all these math problems. How about 4/5 times 1/8, Mr. Barberry asked. Bethany, want to take this one? There was no answer, so Mr. Barberry turned around. Bethany? Owen threw a look over his shoulder and saw Bethany hunched down behind her math book, her head not even visible. She wasn't actually sleeping, was she? That'd be brave. Dumb, but brave. Either way, at least something was happening, and that meant class got just a fraction less boring. Owen covered his smile with his hand. Fraction. Ha ha ha! You can see how Owen's a little bit like me. Bethany! Mr. Barberry shouted. Bethany jerked back in her chair, and her math book tumbled forward, revealing something else behind it. Charlie in the Chocolate Factory. Uh-oh. Mr. Barberry just glared at Bethany for a second as she looked around, a mix of confusion and fear on her face. Owen winced, waiting for Mr. Barberry to start yelling, but fortunately the bell rang right at that moment, releasing them for lunch. Okay, go, Mr. Barberry said. Everyone but you, Bethany. The girl nodded, her long, bronze-colored hair falling forward over her face. Owen threw a sympathetic look back at her, then noticed something weird. Was that chocolate on her chin? But then the other students blocked his view, and he shrugged, not willing to get to chance getting yelled at too. Besides, lunch meant at least he had a half hour of no fractions. After waiting in a lunch line that he'd have to remember to add to his list of the most boring things ever, Owen carried his tray of pizza and milk around the cafeteria looking for a seat. He considered one table with some boys from his class, but they ignored him as he walked over, so he kept going, pretending he'd always meant to sit by himself. That's why he brought a book anyway. Sitting by himself wasn't exactly new. Owen had read Kiel Nomenfoot and The End of Everything twice now, but the 7th book in the series was coming out next week, so it couldn't hurt to catch up. It'd been hard enough getting a copy out of the library anyway, despite the fact his mom worked there. This was the book that ended with Dr. Verity surprise attacking the Magister, Kiel's teacher, after all. Owen personally knew at least 5 people who had cried at the idea that the Magister might die. And 10 people who called the series a Harry Potter ripoff, which it sort of was, but everyone still loved it. As Owen started to read the last chapter, where Dr. Verity broke into the Magister's upside-down tower, he saw Bethany stomp into the cafeteria out of the corner of his eye. She plopped down at a table on the other side of the room, then pulled out her book and looked around suspiciously. Suspicious. Then she dropped her head, ate something, and sat back up, glancing around again. What was she doing? Eating behind the book? Did she even have food? Was she? Whoops! What she was now was staring at him. Owen immediately looked everywhere but at Bethany, but it was way too late. She slammed her book closed, threw him a dirty look, then exited the cafeteria with an annoyed huff. I can't really do that. Owen sighed and dropped his own book onto the table. She was probably feeling embarrassed after getting yelled at and didn't want anyone staring at her, which meant he'd just made things worse. Awesome. His guilt pushed Owen up out of his seat and after Bethany to apologize or make a joke, something. Only by the time he got to the hallway, there was no Bethany. In fact, the entire hallway is completely empty, except for the copy of Charlie and the Chocolate Factory Bethany had just been reading, which now lay on the floor just beneath the locker. Not only had she left her book on the floor, but worse, Owen could tell even from a distance that it had come from his mom's library. That wasn't even her book. And were those chocolate stains on it? That was not cool. What was Bethany thinking? Who checked out a book and got chocolate all over it, even if, it fit the story? Other people wanted to read these books too and didn't want to have food stains on their copies. Owen has very strict ideas of what people should do with library books, which he's right. Shaking his head, Owen grabbed the book and dropped it into his bag, then walked back into the cafeteria to get back to important things, like Dr. Verity's attack on the Magister. Unfortunately, the bell decided to ring then, cruel, but expected. Owen sighed, threw away his garbage, and tromped back to another few hours of mind-numbing semi-learning. Eventually, mercifully, the day ended, and Owen exploded out the front door like he was launched from a cannon. It felt so good to be out that he walked that much quicker to his mom's library, where she worked almost every night. As usual, Owen would go by and help out where he could, mostly because she made him, fair, but partly because it was just fun being around all the books. He said hi to his mom, who was running around with too much to do, as usual, then took his normal spot at the front desk, where he checked people's books out for a few hours. This job could be either interesting, because he was seeing what people were reading, embarrassing, because he was seeing what people were reading, or boring, because he was seeing what people were reading. Usually it managed to cover at least 2 of the 3 every few minutes, and tonight was no different. When things finally cooled down, Owen sighed and pulled out his homework, knowing that his mother, no matter how busy she was, would notice he wasn't busy and make him do it anyway. Only when he went to pull out his math book, there was Bethany's copy of Charlie and the Chocolate Factory in his bag. Whoops, he'd sort of forgotten all about that. He'd picked it up, meaning to give it back to Bethany, and glare at her judgmentally for the chocolate stains, obviously. But now that he thought about it, had she even been in science after lunch? He couldn't remember her being there, or in any other class that afternoon. Maybe she'd gone home sick after eating too much chocolate and using the library book as a napkin. Owen shrugged and checked the book back into the library. She knew where to find it if she wanted it again. His mother caught him putting the book on a pile that was supposed to go back onto the shelves and gave him a look. He sighed and stood up, knowing where this was going. "Those all go in the children's section," she said. "I'm locking up, but I have a few things to take care of in the office after that, so finish your homework when you're done." Ugh, of course. Owen picked up a pile of books about half as tall as he was, then walked them slowly back to the children's section. As usual, it was a mess, like a hurricane had plowed into a nuclear bomb right through the Rick Riordan books. Riordan? Riordan? I don't know how to pronounce his name. Good books, though. Owen sighed and dug in, pulling a few interesting books aside as he noticed them. That was the only good part about cleanup. He'd sometimes find things that looked like a good read. 10 minutes later, the children's section was at least cleaner, with random piles stacked on top of overfull shelves. Owen looked sadly at the stack of books he'd carried here to put back, then sighed again and picked up Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, knowing there'd be no room for it. But then, as he found the D section for Roald Dahl, something weird happened. His hand jumped. He looked down at his hand and the book in it, thinking he'd just imagined the jolt, but the book in his hand jumped again. "Gah!" he shouted, dropping the book. That's a normal noise. It smacked the floor hard and just sat there for a moment. Then it jumped a third time. What was happening? Owen backed away as the cover and a bunch of pages flipped open, all by themselves. Was the book haunted? Was the entire library haunted? Was it okay to find that awesome, even while he was being terrified? And then, the last thing in the world that Owen ever expected happened. 5 chocolate-covered fingers pushed right up out of the center of the book, grabbed the edge, and began to pull themselves out. Creepy. So that's the end of chapter 1. I want to share all kinds of stuff with you about Story Thieves. I love Bethany. I love this story. I love how she's smiling, and Keel Nomenfoot, who is up here in the black, is not, even though that's kind of the opposite of what they usually are. I will tell you all a lot more as I keep reading, so come back soon for chapter 2. And if you come back tomorrow, I should have chapter 1 of Revenge of Magic ready to go, just in case you haven't read that one yourself. So thank you very much for listening. I hope you enjoy it, and I will see you soon. Bye.